Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, thank you for joining this webinar. I just wanted to check the sound. So can you see me? Can you hear me? Please write in chat. Okay, good, right. Elena can see me. Okay, excellent, right. Wonderful, good. I'm very glad everything's working. Okay, let's get started. And today in this webinar, we will look at what tasks a teacher needs to accomplish at the beginning of the school year and actually how to accomplish them. We will also be discussing the specifics of beginning the school year online as well as offline, how to motivate your students from the very beginning, and of course some practical time management tips for teachers. If you have any questions, please feel free to write them into the section questions, which is in the right hand corner of your screen. And at the end of each slide, I will make a pause and do my best to answer them. Okay, right, good. Well, we may officially begin. So the beginning of the school year is, of course, a crucial time because apart from just teaching English, there is a whole number of other things that you need to consider. And the first one is desk arrangement, in fact. So you need to think about creating a learning environment offline as well as online, depending on where you are teaching. And of course, if you're teaching a group, it's very helpful to prepare the actual learning environment where you'll be doing it. And if you think about classroom arrangement, you may think about desk arrangement, about wall decoration, about resources available in the classroom. Speaking of desk arrangement, it should reflect the kind of activities which you use most often during a class. So your basic options are horseshoe or semicircle, which is where all of the students are facing the board and there is a large open space in the center. Another way you can do this is to arrange the desks in a full circle. And finally, you may put them into pairs or groups of 4. Now then, the difference, as I mentioned, is you have to think about what sort of activities you prefer during the lesson. So make sure that your desk arrangement reflects that. For example, the horseshoe arrangement is great for young learners because you can have a large area in the center of the room where you can sit or play games. If your lesson involves a lot of whole class participation activities, then this is also a very good arrangement for adult learners because you will have free access and you will be able to see what all of them are doing at the same time. Teens tend to enjoy sitting in groups of 4 and adults prefer sitting in pairs because they might need partners for role plays or pair work. And keep in mind the interesting fact that students tend to speak more if they sit facing each other. So if you're teaching an exam preparation course or a course that involves a lot of individual work, then you may wish to arrange the desks in a more traditional way. This way you can talk to each student individually without disturbing the others. Another thing, so as we've said, the desk arrangement should reflect the activities that you do, and also it will most likely reflect your teaching style. So if your lessons are more traditional and teacher-centered, then your own desk will most likely be at the front of the room. On the other hand, if you feel that you need to bond with your students, then you may choose to, in fact, abandon your desk and even sit with them. Yes, sit in the midst of your class. Okay? Any questions concerning desk arrangement? It's a little practicality, but quite important. Okay, no questions yet. Right, okay, let's move on to our next point. Yes, something else that we need to think about. And the second point is classroom decoration. Okay, and if, of course, it depends on whether you are lucky to have the whole classroom to yourself and to your teaching. But if you are one of those lucky teachers, then think about decorating your classroom. This will be extremely helpful for creating a language atmosphere in your classroom and sort of getting your students into the English mood, so to speak. There are all sorts of things you can decorate decorate your classroom with. Yeah, these are just some of the ideas. So you can put charts with rules or verb forms. You can put photos of places or objects related to English-speaking countries. You can have some jokes, some quotes, some proverbs. You can decorate the walls with student projects. It's extremely motivating. You can put photos of your students, and if all else fails, I'm joking, of course, you can have a map of England. Yeah, all of these things will help you to create the English atmosphere, yeah, and an interesting learning environment for your students. Okay. And finally, think about what resources you will have in your classroom, which you will use during the year. So again, this depends, of course, on the technical and financial sort of options that you have, but some very helpful resources for an English classroom would be a laptop, of course, a projector, a whiteboard, an interactive board, perhaps, dictionaries, especially if you have a no-phone policy. Yeah, of course, if you allow your students to use phones, then they might find that more convenient than using a dictionary, but still a couple of dictionaries will always come in handy. You can have flashcards, dice, puppets and toys for children, vocabulary cards, graded readers, and even a ball, which is, for instance, very handy when it comes to drilling. Okay, so these are all the resources that you might find very useful. Okay, and we've discussed, of course, creating a learning environment offline. Yeah, we have to think about desks and resources and equipment. Now then, if you are teaching online, you will need to consider completely different things, and these will include software for lessons, communication software, format of lesson materials, whether you're going to use PowerPoint or PDF. Yeah, these little practicalities also matter. You will need to think about technical equipment, of course, and about lesson environment, and I will get to that in a second. So let's start with software for lessons. The most widely used software is, of course, Skype, Zoom. In fact, I would recommend using Zoom over Skype, as it's much more reliable and the quality of sound and image is much higher. And you may also wish to use Google Drive for sending your students large materials, videos, or even homework. And make sure that your student knows how to use all of these programs, because you'd be surprised at how many students don't. And of course, make sure that they have an active account so that you can get into your lesson straight away. Of course, you will need to agree with your student on the best way to reach them and to send them homework. So you may use email, Skype, Telegram, Viber. I would recommend asking your student what's more convenient for them. And also think about what resources you will use to teach your student online. So you may choose to prepare your own materials in PowerPoint, Keynote, Word, or PDF format. You may choose to use an electronic textbook and supplementary materials, or you might decide to follow a ready-made online course, such as the Wimbooks courses on Skyeng, for instance, where you don't really need to do any preparation. You and your student already follow the materials which have been put into electronic format, and this is, of course, extremely convenient. And for teaching online, you will need to get and then check your headset, your Wi-Fi speed, and your webcam quality, because these things are crucial, in fact, for having a successful lesson. Another tip, if you're teaching online, is at the beginning of the year, designate and prepare a place in your room for teaching. So ideally, this will be against a wall or against a background that doesn't reveal too much about you. So sort of no dirty dishes in the background. And think about how you will avoid distractions and disturbances during the lesson, especially if your family is at home, because it looks highly unprofessional if you have your children or your pets sort of running in the background or distracting you from actual teaching. Okay, any questions at this point? Okay, right. Well, yes, if they do come along, please make sure that you post them. Okay, moving on, we've discussed the practicalities of beginning the school year online and offline, and now we come to classroom management. And again, you need to have a classroom management strategy as soon as possible, and the beginning of the year is in fact a great time to establish some rules which the students will get used to and follow throughout the year. So while you may spend some time figuring out the curriculum and getting to know your students, teacher authority is something that you need to establish from the very beginning, because the students need to respect you in order for you to have control of the classroom environment and actually be able to teach them something. So with children, at the very beginning of the school year, you may choose to hang a set of rules on the wall and go over them together. So have them discuss why these rules are important and how their peers should behave in order to make learning more comfortable for everybody. Establishing rules with a group of adults might seem trickier because you don't want to seem condescending. However, you may choose to follow some of the classroom management tips which you can see on the slide, and they should help you to create a comfortable and productive learning environment. So the first tip is to get the rules in writing. For instance, if you're really bothered by the use of cell phones and other electronics during class time, then you need to say so in the syllabus. And if you would prefer students to spend the majority of time speaking English in class, which I'm sure you would, then you might mention that as well and give them a reason, yeah. So it's good to explain rules, and if people understand why you have these rules in place, they might be more likely to follow them. Okay, and we have a question from Yelena. How does the board look if you have it in the background? I'm not sure what you mean, Yelena. So are we talking about a teaching environment online or offline? If you have, okay, so please, if you could write that in questions, and I'll come back to that question in a second, yeah? Online, if you have a board in the background. So, in fact, a good idea would be you might have a board or some rules or a poster on the wall behind you. This is actually as close as you can get to creating a learning environment online, yeah? So I think that is a great idea. Or maybe you can have some verb forms, yeah, just behind you that the student can look at. That's an excellent idea, yes. So why not use the wall behind you to your advantage, even if you're teaching offline, yeah, online, excuse me, yes. So thank you very much for that suggestion. Okay, so we were talking about classroom management, and the first tip was to get your rules in writing, and the second tip is have a plan. What I mean by that is that as well as letting your students know the rules, you should have a classroom management plan for yourself, and by this I mean that it's a good idea to think through what you would do in certain situations before these situations actually happen. So, for instance, think what you would do if you find that a student had copied their paper off the internet, or what you would do if a student doesn't seem to stop talking during your lesson. So, good idea to be prepared for these common problems in classroom management. And the third tip is to establish a routine during your lessons. If the students know what they should be doing during the lesson, and if they are busy doing relevant work, then you will notice there is much less chance that there will be classroom management concerns. And there are several ways that you can establish a study routine. One way is to start a lesson with a single activity, and this activity will become a habit for every lesson that follows. For example, let's say you're teaching young learners, and you can start each lesson with a song, and this can be the same song for entire semester, and then you can the next semester you can switch and learn a different one. This can be your way, so the song can become your way of greeting each other and marking the official start of the lesson. And having this one routine task really adds an element of discipline to the lesson. Okay, and needless to say that, of course, course, if we're talking about young learners, they really thrive on habits and routines. So it's really helpful to have some solid rules and some solid routines in place for them. For older students, you may also choose one activity with which you start the lesson. So, for instance, you can start the lesson with What's New segment, and your learners will share a piece of news they've heard over the weekend or they've heard since the last lesson you had. Or you can start each lesson with a different tongue twister to sort of get them in shape and loosen up those lazy tongues. The third way you can go about this is you may choose to establish a stable study routine for the whole lesson, which will be the same for the lesson. For instance, you start each lesson with homework check, then you watch a video, then you discuss, then you read a text, then you answer questions, then you do listening, then you do some grammar, then you do exercises, and you finish the lesson with speaking. Of course, that's quite a large syllabus, but just as an example. So if you have a stable routine, if you have the same routine which you follow each lesson, then it's a good idea to begin the lesson with something new each time. So one day you may choose to begin the lesson with a tongue twister, the next day with a game, the third day with a song, and so on. So whichever of these strategies you choose, make sure that your lessons have both elements of the established routine and elements of something new. So because on one hand, you need to give the students a feeling that their learning has a systematic approach, but on the other hand, you need to keep your lessons fresh and interesting with new elements, yeah? So keep your students on their toes a little bit. Okay, any questions? Okay, good. Yeah, if you have any questions that you want to make sure I don't miss, then please write them into the section at the top. Okay, I will definitely be checking those. Okay, and now we move on to the tricky issue of time management. So as well as behavior rules and study routine, you might also want to have some time management rules in place from the very beginning. And my go-to time management rules for teaching group lessons are, there are two of them. One is hold the question, and the other one is encourage competition. What I mean by them, so hold the questions means that you tell your students to save their questions until the end of the class. It might feel like you are denying your students answers to their questions, but in fact you are not, because by keeping all the questions until the end of the class, you make sure that your time is focused and your students are concentrating on the activity that you've prepared for them, instead of getting constantly distracted by each other's questions, which can turn into long answers and long discussions, because you do want to get through the material that you've given them, through the material that you've prepared for the lesson. To make sure the students don't forget their questions, you may want to give each of them several post-it notes at the beginning of the lesson to stick on their desks, and they can jot down their questions that they have during the lesson. And that way, when you are ready to take their questions at the end of the lesson, they will not have forgotten them. And also, long questions, answers, and discussions will not disrupt the flow of your lesson. Okay, so this is my first tip. And the second one is to encourage competition during the lesson if you're teaching a group, because competition can be very useful for motivating and for speeding up your students in the classroom. Sometimes a little healthy competition can help them to approach the task with more energy and complete it quicker than they would have otherwise. However, be careful not to overuse this strategy, because you may find that while chasing speed, the quality of your students' work begins to deteriorate. So in this case, you need to use your judgment when deciding how much competition you want to include in your lesson. And of course, don't turn every single task and exercise into competition, because it quickly gets boring. So having one competitive task for once a lesson, or maybe once a week, is quite enough. Okay. Any questions we have at this point? Okay, we have a question from Konstantin. Can we introduce these round activities in the middle of the course if we haven't done it from the beginning? Wouldn't it look strange to a student? That's a very good question. So my personal opinion is that the best time to establish routines and rules is the beginning of the year. However, I mean, as a teacher, you're often, you spend the beginning of the school year testing out, trying out different strategies, different materials, different exercises. So it might be the middle of the year when you get to having worked out the best routine that you have for your students. So my answer to you is the quicker you do this, the better. But again, you want to have the best routine for your students, and this might take some time to establish. Whether it would seem strange to the student, I wouldn't say it seems strange, because students are interested in getting the best quality lessons they can. So even if they start getting these excellent study routines and excellent lessons in the middle of the school year, it's still better than never. So if you have a great idea, include it into the lesson. Don't be afraid to disrupt your study routine a little bit, even if it's the middle of the year. Okay, so thank you very much for that question, Konstantin. And moving on, we're going to now talk about student motivation. And again, the sooner you do it, the better. So this is in fact no less important than the practical and the organizational aspects which we've discussed. And the beginning of the year is something that I really believe at the beginning of the year is the time to motivate your students and get them prepared for what lies ahead. The first thing is a new school year should bring about new resolutions, both for teachers and for you. So at the very beginning, you can have students partner up with each other and discuss what goals they have for themselves for the school year. This is, in fact, very motivating. So encourage them to be specific with the things that they would like to accomplish and what they want to be different this year comparing to the previous year. And while the students are talking together, you can have them create a poster of their resolutions and then display the posters around the room to help students remember their goals throughout the term. Okay, so this is the first sort of motivating thing you can do. Of course, some students, especially young learners and teenagers, might not always have a clear idea of what they expect from their lessons. However, they will be motivated to study if you present them with an engaging and relevant curriculum. So the second tip is, of course, make your lessons interesting, and to ensure that that happens and that your curriculum is engaging and relevant, you need to get to know your students, and this is something that we are going to get into right now before we move on to the third tip, which is to create a friendly and positive atmosphere. Okay, so getting to know your students, this is definitely something that you need to do at the beginning of the school year, and this involves finding out their English level, finding out their learning goals, and finding out their interests and preferences. So even when teaching a group, I try to have a one-on-one chat with each student at the beginning of the year, and this chat serves three purposes. So the first one is that it helps you to get a much clearer idea of the student's level and what they need to work on, and in fact you will get a much clearer idea from a short conversation with the student than from having them do a test, because a student might have a very good passive knowledge of English that enables them to answer every test question correctly. However, they might have problems speaking fluently or actually using the grammar and the vocabulary that they know in speech. So the only way that you can find out their active knowledge of English is, of course, through hearing them speak. The second reason why it's such a great idea to have a one-on-one chat is that it helps you to find out about the student's learning goals and preferences and actually discuss with the student how these goals and preferences that they have might fit in with the general goals and preferences of the whole group. And of course, a one-on-one time allows you to establish a personal connection with the student, and it will be much easier for you to teach a first lesson to a group of people that you've already met rather than coming to a classroom full of completely new faces. So this is something that I definitely recommend. Okay, and we have a question from Kent Sellers. Is there a common exam the teachers use to find a student's level? Okay, well, of course, you have all the official Cambridge exams, starting from FCE, ending with the CPE. I wouldn't, I mean, if your student has a diploma or an exam that they've taken that they can show you, this is of course amazing because it saves you the trouble of having to test them yourself. But a lot of students will come into your group without having taken any official exams. And in this case, it's a good idea to have a test ready to prepare them. And you can either create this test yourself, and I will get into this in a second about what kind of things you might want to include in your text, or there is a whole list of tests that you can find online. Yes, starting with an online British Council test that you can give to your students, and again it will give you some idea of their level. Again, all the online tests are of course written tests designed to test your students' perhaps passive knowledge of English, so it's a very good idea, as well as giving them a written grammar or vocabulary test, to prepare a test to test their speaking. And this is actually what I will get into very soon. So thank you very much for that question. And we have one more. How many levels are there? So there are 6 levels, starting with A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, and C2. Yes, so there are 6 official English levels, which and this is usually how the students are grouped, yeah, depending on their level. Okay, right, and speaking of levels, if it's not possible to have even a 5-minute chat with each of the students personally, then it's a good idea to prepare a list of questions on a certain topic and have your students discuss these questions in pairs during the lesson. While they're doing that, you can walk around and listen in on each of the pairs to get some idea of their level. However, again, this sort of strategy of walking around and stopping and listening in might make your students feel uncomfortable and restrict their speech. So instead, what you can do is you can arrange the desks or chairs in a circle while you sit in the middle. And this way you can listen in on each pair speaking without seeming obtrusive. And of course, try and take notes on each student speaking, because this will be very helpful later on. Okay. The second thing you can do to find out your student's level is to give them a set of written questions. I'm talking about written questions where they have to give full answers rather than test questions. And these written questions can be, in fact, grammar questions in disguise. So, for example, if you ask them to describe their day yesterday, this is, in fact, a question to test whether they can use past simple. If you include a question, describe your plans for this weekend, this will be a question to test their use of future tenses. If you include a question, describe your achievements, travel experiences, recent news, this is a question to test whether your students can use present perfect. So these kind of disguised grammar questions are very helpful for sort of seeing which tenses, how far your students are in tenses, and this in turn will give you an idea of their grammar level and what sort of curriculum you will need to plan. And thirdly, you can ask your students to write a paragraph about themselves, and this task has several bonuses, because the first one is that any student, unless they are a complete beginner, of course, will be able to write something about themselves. So you're not giving them a task that will discourage them, but you're actually giving them a task that they will be able to complete, yeah, even if they have a low level of English. Secondly, this task will give you a chance to get the students, if there isn't a possibility to have a one-on-one chat with them. And finally, this piece of free writing will demonstrate what you need to work on, yeah, outside the specific grammar questions. What you can do with this personal paragraph task is that you can keep all the students writing, and on the last day of the term you can give these back to your students and ask them to correct the mistakes and see how far they've progressed in their writing skills. So this activity presents a very tangible evidence of how far your students have come during the year, and this is something that will definitely motivate them. And a good question is, what do I do if I have a multi-level class? And in my experience, even if the students have been grouped according to level, even if they have taken official tests, you will still have some difference in levels, no matter which group you teach. So in fact, this is something that these assessments that we've just discussed can show you, that you have students of different levels within the same group. And there are several ways you can deal with this. So the first strategy you can use is called grouping. And one of the ways to successfully teach a multi-level group is to group the students within that group according to their level. So you can use the assessments that they do at the beginning of the year to make a decision about grouping for each lesson or activity that you do afterwards. Sometimes it makes sense to group students of similar ability levels, such as when doing a listening comprehension task. So you have them do the listening comprehension, and then you have them check their answers with a partner who has a similar level to them. At other times, for instance, if you are doing a discussion or speaking activity, you can actually group students across levels, so you can have a stronger and a weaker student working together, which might be beneficial for both of them. So again, it depends. Your grouping strategy will depend on the activity that you are doing and, of course, on knowing your students. Okay, so the first strategy for multi-level groups is grouping, and the second one is multi-level tasks. So for instance, while you might have all the students in your group learning the same topic or practicing the same skill, you may choose to prepare different tasks for doing this and hand out the tasks to each of your students according to their level. Of course, this requires extra work and extra preparation, so it's really up to you whether you're going to do it. But for instance, if you are studying present perfect, some of your students will require more tasks to practice the form, and other students might grasp the form very quickly and be ready to progress on to present perfect versus past simple tasks, for instance. So it's a good idea to have to differentiate the task that you give them. At the same time, try to be subtle about this and avoid emphasizing that some of the students are doing more difficult tasks and some of them are doing easier tasks, yeah, to make sure that you don't make any of them feel bad or demotivated. Okay, and we've discussed how you can find out your students' level, and of course here is what we've just discussed about multi-level class and about the tasks that you can give them. Okay, so just to sum up, to find out their level, you can do a one-on-one chat, you can have them do a pair discussion, you can give them some disguised grammar questions, and you can ask them to write a paragraph about themselves. Yeah, all of these will give you a better idea of the student's level rather than just giving them a typical ABC test. Okay, and next you need to find out your students' goals. This is a key to motivating them, because if your student feels that they are learning what they need, then they will be much more motivated to study. To determine your students' goals, ask them these 4 simple questions. The first one is, where are you going to speak English? And this question will help you to find out the environment where the student will be using English. The second question, who are you going to speak English with? So will it be with your boss, with your husband perhaps, with tourists, with people at work? This will give you very crucial information. Third question, what topics, what problems might you be discussing in English, and what problems did you have when you used English previously? And the fourth question is when are you going to speak English? So you want to find out if your student is preparing for a specific goal, such as taking an exam or a trip that they might have, or a business presentation. All of these will give you some information about what kind of curriculum you should prepare, and about the time limits, yeah, that you have until to help your student achieve their goal. And answering, when your student answers these questions, the answers that they give will help you identify their language problems and tie the course to a specific and achievable goal. So you may choose to do this 4-question interview at the beginning of the course but nevertheless your student will continue to feel that they are following a personalized course with an individual approach to their needs. Yeah, they will see that you care about them and not just sort of teaching the group in general. Once you have successfully determined your students' learning goals, you can choose a course that will keep them motivated to study and help them achieve the desired result. Of course, it's much easier to do this if you're teaching one-on-one online, but even with a group, you might think of ways to make each student feel that they are getting something there for themselves. As I mentioned, that they're getting some individual approach despite being in a group. And it's also possible that your students' learning goals may change after a while. So if you notice that your student seems less motivated than usual at some point in the course, then you can ask them for questions again during the middle of the course, for instance. And if necessary, you might need to change the course or adapt it to fit the student's new learning goals, because of course goals have tendency to change. So as I mentioned, these 4 questions work best if you are teaching the student one-on-one, because of course you're more flexible and you can adapt the course depending on what goals they have. If you're teaching a group, then of course it's very likely that most of your students will have different needs and different goals. Nevertheless, you should try and identify the one thing that they all have in common. For instance, they might all be preparing for an exam at the end of the year, and then you can use this common goal that they have to tailor your activities and lesson plans. Okay, any questions? Whether you will get a copy of this presentation? Well, this webinar will be recorded and uploaded on the Skyeng website, so you will be able to get the presentation and the webinar in video form. Okay, any more questions? Yes, and of course you can download the webinar, the presentation without the video commentary if that's more convenient. Okay, so we've talked about finding out your students' level, finding out their learning goals through asking the 4 questions. And the third thing, it's a great idea to find out about your students' interests and preferences. So the first thing is, if you can have a one-on-one chat with your student, then asking a subtle, unobtrusive questions such as, what is your typical day like, will help you find out a whole host of information. So normally you would find out from this question whether your student is married and has children, which, believe me, influences the time they can spend studying and their the achievement they might make. From the question, what is your typical day like, you can find out if they have a full-time job and if they have any hobbies or activities that they do regularly. This information will be very useful for, first of all, planning relevant lessons, and it's also good to know about how busy your student is in case problems arise. So, for instance, your student might not be doing homework, not because they are lazy, but because they have too much on their plate with family or work commitments. And over the course of the next few lessons, you may wish to observe the student and find out about their learning style. Some students will be more motivated to learn with songs and music, others with arts and crafts. Some students will thrive on total physical response, which makes it a good idea to include some physical activities and games that might help them with their language. And naturally, not all of your students will fit into one single category, but it's tremendously useful for you to know if you have a predominance of musical, visual, or kinesthetic learners. And you can use this knowledge to teach them the necessary material through activities that target their natural talents. Another quicker way to find out about your students' interests and learning preferences, if you can't have a one-on-one chat, is to give them a questionnaire in form of a test. Yeah, so in this case, a test would work just fine. So I've mentioned the one-on-one chat that you might want to have with your student in the beginning of the year quite a lot. And here are some questions that you may wish to ask your student. So how long have you been learning English? Do you use English in your workplace? And what do you use it for? Is it emails, telephone calls, meeting, or dealing with native speakers? Because this might give you a clue whether your student needs to focus on writing more than speaking, or if it's the other way around. Do you need to study English for any exams, such as IELTS or TOEFL? This is, of course, crucial. Do you wish to improve your English skills for traveling abroad or communication with people from other countries? What other topics do you find interesting or enjoyable? So, is your student into sports, news, fashion, entertainment? Another question you might ask them is, do you want to study grammar in class, or do you want to concentrate on communication skills? skills. For instance, you might have a student who you teach only 1 or 2 hours a week, in which case it might be a good idea to give them writing and grammar as homework and focus your lessons on speaking, because that's the only speaking practice they're going to get in lessons with you. You might wish to ask your student if they want to be given homework. Of course, I never ask this question when teaching children, but with adults, of course, you might need to be more lenient, yes, and if the student refuses to do homework, well, that's tough. Then you need to think how you will plan your lessons around that. You can ask them how much time they can spend on learning English. Again, this will help you to plan the intensity of lessons and the amount of homework you give them, and you can ask them what they expect to achieve from this course. Yeah, this is a modified goal question that again will help you to choose the best course, the best curriculum, and tailor it to their needs. And speaking of curriculum, but before we do that, we have a question. How can you, from Svetlana, how can you interest students into learning via Skype, which may save time and give time to study? Well, actually, your question has the best answer. If you can convince your student that your Skype lessons are in no way inferior to one-on-one learning, and the way you can do that is by offering them a free trial lesson via Skype. If you have prepared for this lesson, most likely your student will see that there is very little difference between learning on Skype and offline, face-to-face, and then they will be motivated to continue the lesson. So the first tip is give them a free trial lesson on Skype. The second one is, of course, you just need to tell them that by learning via Skype, they don't need to travel anywhere, their teacher doesn't need to travel to them, and you can that the time that, for instance, I would spend on getting to you, I can spend on preparing the lesson, and the time that you would spend on getting to me, you can spend on actually studying English or doing some extra tasks. So I think your biggest argument here is that there is technically no difference comparing the input that you get online or offline. You can still see me, you can still hear me. And the second point you can mention is that, of course, time is crucial in language learning, and by studying via Skype, you are saving yourself a lot of time, which you can sort of employ to better means. Okay, yes, perhaps it's obvious, but you would be surprised about with how many students are skeptical of sort of learning via Skype. They seem to think that it doesn't work, so you might need to give your student a pep talk and show them that they're learning in no way, again, this is my opinion, but in no way their learning will suffer from learning via Skype. It's sort of the way of the future. Okay, now then, moving on to curriculum. Once you have found out your students' level, interests, preferences, and learning goals, it's crucial for you to think about the next big task, which is choosing the right materials and planning successful lessons. And of course, the sooner you start doing this, the better. And if you have a curriculum at the beginning of the school year, which you will follow, then of course, this gives your students the impression that you are an organized and well-prepared teacher. So here are some tips for choosing the materials that you will use for teaching your students throughout the year. So the first one is during the first few lessons, you are still establishing the routine. So this is the time to try out different materials or textbooks to see what works best. Definitely it's better to do the trying out at the beginning of the year rather than change to a new textbook in the middle of the year and ask your student to buy new materials. Okay, and so once you've spent the first few lessons trying different things out, you can see what works best, and afterwards just take these best resources or the textbook that seems to work with your students and stick to them throughout the year. The second tip is while you're reading the curriculum or textbook content, you might need to ask yourself some of these questions, which you can see on the slide. So the first question you should ask yourself, is the curriculum at the appropriate level for my students? So just because you're teaching an intermediate class or A2 class, it doesn't mean that your students are at intermediate level. material. So you need to give the activities a hard look and determine if your students will be able to successfully learn the material that they should learn at this level through these activities offered in the textbook. So you might need to eliminate the activities that are too hard or too easy for your class. The second question to ask is, does the curriculum, does the textbook or the curriculum that you've been offered cover reading, writing, listening, speaking, vocabulary, and grammar? So if you notice that the lesson or the unit doesn't cover some of these areas, then you need to make a note and think about that later. And the third question when looking at the curriculum is, do the given activities touch on different learning styles? So, for instance, are there activities that have students working on their own, as well as activities that have them working in groups? Is the curriculum communicative? Does it include something visual, something oral, something kinesthetic, something logical, something social for each of the learning styles? So again, you need to make note. For example, if the textbook you're using has no visual activities or visual material, then you might need to supplement it. And once you've asked yourself these three questions, you will have a good idea of where you need to supplement. So you can make notes of any area that isn't covered in the curriculum, and or what you can do is you can make a checklist with your goals and see how the curriculum applies to your goals and your checklist, and whether the curriculum covers the different areas of language instruction that need to be covered, and whether it covers the different learning styles that you might have within the group or with your student. So you can check one of the list as you read through the curriculum, and the points that you haven't checked are the activities that you need to supplement. So for instance, these may cover missing language skill areas, or you might need to find some activities to cover the missing learning styles. For instance, you might need to prepare some more visual material, or you might need to prepare additional activities that will give your students more practice on the topic that they are studying, because with most textbooks they usually touch on the topic and there are never enough activities to give the students the amount of practice that they need to actually learn the grammar or the vocabulary topic and be able to use it. So to sum up, in my opinion, no textbook offers enough materials to fully master a grammar or vocabulary topic, and even the best curriculums and lesson plans need supplementing. So if you have a main textbook then that you may choose to stick to, or that you may have to stick to, do that and stick to the topics. However, make sure that you supplement these topics with materials from other textbooks and other sources to give your students enough practice and to cover everything that is not covered by the main textbook that you're using. And a good study course can be so much more than just following a textbook. A very common question is that what do I do if my language school or my employer has assigned me a really boring textbook to teach? And the trick here is to keep to the topics of the textbook, but use other sources to teach these topics, because you don't want your students to hate your lessons just because you've been assigned the boring textbook. So you need to be flexible and kind of walk around the issue. What you can do is you can choose 1 or 2 tasks from the textbook to do during each lesson, and this should be enough to keep up appearances that you are actually using this textbook. But the rest of the lesson, try to teach these topics using more interesting and effective materials, because of course you're interested in your students enjoying the lessons and achieving the results. Yeah. So again, the way around this problem of having a boring textbook is through supplementing it with additional tasks. Okay, and we have a question from Kent Sellers. Are there online curriculum that you know that serve as good guideline for developing your own curriculum? Well, the curriculum that I use even when developing my own curriculum is the curriculum that we have on Skyeng or on the website of our language school. So why I like using this curriculum, it has a very clear list of topics that need to be covered at each level. And there is, for instance, a grammar section, there is a vocabulary, there is, well, a general English course. So I like to stick to these topics, and I like to supplement them with my own activities. So of course it's a very good idea to have a strict curriculum, to know what you're doing, and you can supplement it as you go. Yes, so the curriculum that I would of course recommend is the one that we use at our school. Of course you can also use the British Council website, so they have a list of grammar or vocabulary topics and lesson plans for each level. So yeah, the two that I would recommend are British Council and the one that we use at Skyeng. Okay, so thank you for that question. Right, and just to discuss supplementing a little bit more, because it's such an important part of planning your curriculum. As well as deciding on a textbook, there is a whole number of other resources that a good teacher will have prepared for their lessons. So these may include, you can see some of the ideas on the slide, warm-up or cool-down ideas, fillers, games, resources that will give your students extra practice in each of the 4 skills, such as reading, writing, listening, and speaking. These may include websites, apps, graded readers, writing prompts, essay topics, speaking questions, videos, songs, project ideas. Again, all of these are extremely useful because, as we've said, teaching English is so much more than just following a textbook, and a textbook never seems to have enough materials to cover all the 4 skills that we need to practice. So all of these supplementary materials will be a great asset to your lesson. Okay, and of course, when you're planning your curriculum, you need to think again about time management. And you have to keep in mind that your students have goals to accomplish, usually within a certain time frame. So they need to progress as fast as possible in order to gain the proficiency they need for work, for travel, or in the case of children, you need to prepare them for exams. So very often when we analyze our language objectives for the lesson, we need to consider and plan for them individually. And of course, this is fine if time isn't an issue. But if you do have limited time, then you can use a strategy which is called clustering. And basically what you do is you the whole chapter or the unit that you are teaching, and you gather or cluster all the language goals that can be taught together. So for one lesson you might have 4 or 5 or 7 separate language goals, and instead of focusing on each of these goals separately during the lesson and thinking, okay, I need to have a separate activity for covering each separate language goal, try and combine these language goals into one larger goal, and try to prepare activities that cover more than one language goal. So for instance, the speaking task that you prepare, it will not only give your students speaking practice, but it might also give them grammar practice. Yes, so try and combine 2 or more goals if you have limited time into one activity. And the second thing you might want to do is you might want to skip all the unnecessary content in your textbook, which is either not interesting or not relevant to your students' goals, and just focus on the activities that are really great, really interesting, and really help your students to achieve the goals that they have. And we have a question whether we have access to the Skyeng curriculum on the website. As far as I know, you need to be a teacher. Yeah, you need to work for Skyeng, and then you automatically gain access to all the materials, which include, of course, the curriculum. Okay, so yeah, that is how it works. Okay, and another thing, this is again related to the curriculum, but this is something that would be a really great idea to do at the beginning of the school year, is of course material review. So before getting into your freshly compiled curriculum, you may wish to begin the school year with a review of what the students already know. Review lessons are very important, and often they're a wonderful opportunity to consolidate everything your students have learned. But let's face it, review lessons are usually very boring. So boring, in fact, that we don't enjoy them as teachers, and students often feel that they are not really doing anything productive because they usually come to the lesson expecting to learn something new. So here are some tips that will hopefully help you turn a dull review lesson into a razor-sharp learning opportunity. And the first tip is don't go through the list. So of course your students need to review the vocabulary vocabulary and the grammar that they've learned, and naturally you want to have a list of these items for yourself as a teacher, but there is no need to dump the list on your poor unsuspecting students and tell them, okay, we have to get through 16 topics during our lesson. So instead what you can do is you can organize these topics into sets of easily digestible knowledge. What I mean by that is that you might group the 3 or 4 vocabulary topics into one, or you might group several grammar topics into one, for instance, have them review all the past tenses in one activity, and based on how well or poorly they do with that task, you will see if you need to review an individual tense. So don't spend your review lesson checking off the items from a single and never-ending list. The second tip is give your review lesson some variety. So don't base an entire review lesson on just worksheets or just games or just speaking tasks. So include a number of different tasks in your review lesson to make it interesting. The third thing you can do is you can surprise your students. So at the beginning of the lesson, instead of telling them, okay, we're going to have a review lesson and hearing them groan, you can tell them that they will participate in a quiz game show. And you can design a game where students can answer questions for points, such as Who Wants to Be a Millionaire type of game, and you can choose the topics that you want them to practice. So for a review lesson, try to introduce at least one game or activity that your students have never played before, and this should keep them on their toes. And the fourth review strategy you can use is taking questions from your students, and this is a great review activity, especially if you're teaching a group of adult learners who have been very committed and attentive throughout the previous course or the previous year. So the day before the review lesson, you can ask them to look through their course material and write down anything that they don't remember, anything that they missed, or something that they don't understand or are unclear on. And you can take turns answering their questions and clarifying. So very often the chances that several students will have the same questions, which makes it very productive. And you can even have the students answer these questions for each other, to give them some extra practice. So these are the 4 strategies that make review lessons more interesting and more productive. And of course, the third thing we've talked about, getting to know your students, about preparing curriculum. And the third thing that will really motivate them is having a sort of friendly and warm atmosphere within the group. And the way you can create this atmosphere is, of course, by not just getting to know the students yourself, but by getting them to know each other, okay? And there are different icebreakers that you can use to do that. Unfortunately, we do not have time to get into all of them, so I would recommend that you take a screenshot of I've included the names of some icebreakers that I find to be really great, okay, so you can look them up on the internet. There are separate icebreakers that you can use for students who already know each other to get them back into learning mode after their summer holidays, okay, and these are picture storytelling, where you have your students describe their holiday experiences by drawing pictures. There is an icebreaker called Show Your Stuff, where you put them into groups and ask them to prepare a dance or a song or drama performance. And then there is an icebreaker called the lottery, which is where your students take turns to discuss what they would do if they won $1 million. So this is usually quite a fun way to begin the school year. Okay, and of course, it's even more important to create a warm learning atmosphere if your students have never studied together before. And here is a list of icebreakers that you can use to do that, such as, for instance, find objects to describe me. So students can take out several objects out of their bag or bring them from home and explain to the group how these objects relate to them. Or, for instance, another great icebreaker is called Icebreaker Jenga, which is if you have Jenga blocks, you can have your students take turns pulling them out and reading out the questions and answering questions about themselves that are on these blocks. So do feel free to take a screenshot and look up these icebreakers later online and use them to create a learning atmosphere within your group. And of course, you might wish to at the beginning of the year to spend some time introducing yourself to the students. Usually the first lesson is, of course, the best time to do this, and you can do this through a monologue, through having the students ask you questions, by having them play true or false, where you prepare different statements about yourself. Some of them will be true, some of them will be false, and then you can have your students discuss in pairs which ones they think are true and which ones are false. And another icebreaker you can use for introducing yourself is what's the question, which is where you write several answers on the board, such as 6, blue, 12, and Thailand, for instance. These are answers, these words are all somehow related to your life, and you can have students ask you questions to try and make you use one of the answers. So, for instance, your students might ask you, they might see the word Thailand, and then they might ask you the question, what is your favorite country? Yes, and in this case, if you answer Thailand, that means that they have guessed the question correctly. So again, these are the icebreakers that you can use. And of course, we've spent quite a lot of time discussing how to begin the school year offline and all the things that you need to do. You can see them in the list on the slide. The interesting thing is that if you decide to switch to teaching online, there are quite a lot of these things that you don't really need to prepare, such as you don't need to, of course, arrange desks. You don't need to think about the equipment you will use, and for instance, if you are working if you're teaching online and you're working for a language school, then a lot of your teaching works will be eliminated. So for instance, the Skyeng platform, which we use at our school, includes an inbuilt video chat and software, so you don't need to prepare the software for your lessons. It includes the curriculum, all the ready-made materials, an interactive dictionary, self-checking homework tasks, and of course classroom management is also much easier when teaching one-on-one. In fact, something that I found very surprising but true is that students seem to be in fact more focused when learning online rather than face-to-face. So perhaps this can be explained by our screen addiction, but I genuinely believe that teaching online really works and brings results. And of course, things like time management and carrying out a getting to know interview with your student will be also taken care of if you're working for a language school, because there is a methodologist to do all these things. And for instance, at Skyeng we offer 60 different English courses ranging from spoken English to English for engineering, which are designed to fit the need of almost any student. So again, this eliminates your worry of having to prepare a curriculum from scratch. So in fact, the only thing that you might need to worry when you're teaching online is preparing the technical equipment. Everything else in this format is taken care of. Okay, and we have a little bit of time left for questions. Okay, so please, if you have any questions, do let me know now. Okay, yes, thank you very much for your wonderful comments. Yes, I'm sorry my voice was a bit hoarse, but nevertheless, I really enjoyed sharing this information with you. And in a few days after this webinar, you will receive certificates that you have completed it. So yes, please be sure to check your email. Okay, thank you very much for your participation and for joining us. And if you feel the need to review this webinar, then you'll be able to find it on the Skyeng website in a few days. Okay, yes, and we have some questions posted in our no, unfortunately I don't see any posted in our rubric, but I hope that most of your questions have been answered. So thank you very much, everybody, and I hope to see you in our future webinars. So I wish you all a wonderful afternoon or evening or morning, yeah, depending on where you are. Okay, thank you, and goodbye. Yes, so see you in the future, hopefully.